Hey everyone. Today I am overjoyed to have Gregg Henriques with me for some conversation. Gregg is professor at James Madison University. He got his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Vermont, my alma
Woohoo!
mater. Yeah, where the original insight for the unified theory came to him, actually. In 2011, he published a new unified theory of psychology, which I just finished and want to dig into. And that explicitly presents itself as an integrative post-postmodern meta-narrative. So I'd love to dig into that. He writes a regular blog for Psychology Today, where he's introducing ideas like metamodernism, John Vervaeke's 4E cognitive science framework, and his own UTOK paradigm, among many others, to a much broader audience. And so I'm sure not everyone, but a lot of people probably watching this will be already familiar with the work that you've been doing and the conversations you've been having with Vervaeke and Zach Stein and a whole bunch of people in our kind of shared community space. So anyway, yeah, I'd love to dig into some of the UTOK framework and its applications and its vision.
Beautiful.
And yeah, thanks for coming on. So yeah.
Wonderful introduction, man. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to be here. Our connection is overdue, I feel, given that we occupy these similar spaces and watching what you're doing in relationship to metamodern spirituality. It's lovely to be here and good to get a chance to sync up. And I look forward to continuing these conversations
Cool.
down the line. Definitely.
Yeah. 100%. So, all right, well, let's dive in. I wanted to first do a little bit of an overview of the UTOK system, and that could be done any number of ways. I could try to have my go at summarizing it, and then throw it by you, and you could say, is that, did that work? Or
Sure.
you can, or I could just let the maestro speak and kind of give your own sort of summary. I don't know if you have a preference there.
I'm really fluid and flexible. I'm happy. If you want to give it a go, that's good. Certainly, I'm prepared to give it the 5-minute synopsis if you want to. There's a lot to it, as you know.
Sure,
it's kind of like a cathedral. So
yeah,
there's a lot.
All right. Well, how about this? I'll give my little kind of synopsis, and then maybe we can build it out a little bit. And then I'd love to get into some discussion about finding points of intersection, comparison, distinction of a meaningful nature with maybe other frameworks people are familiar with. All right. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is explicitly framed in the terms of the proposition of sort of a postmodern grand meta narrative. I could cite a page reference, even a couple to that regard.
I said that at least, I think I say it twice in the book.
Yeah. So of course that kind of gets my ears up. And then so within that kind of context, which is a very ambitious context, and I would say, to kind of even frame this even a bit more, one of the things I've been seeing as characteristic of this kind of particular moment, which we're kind of calling metamodernism, for that's kind of seemed to be a nice little phrase for this, is a return to thinking about grand narrative frameworks, thinking about grand synthesis projects, thinking, you name very well and I think you do a great job sort of explaining the kind of particularization and the sort of hyper focus on specifics and the sort of fragmented nature that comes about in postmodern theorization and the pitfalls that sort of brings into the situation. And so I feel like where I'm seeing this over and over again is people are recognizing that we need something more than that. We need to integrate the insights of that sort of postmodern contextualization with a bigger understanding of reality. And so this is what you're doing here.
100%.
So more specifically, I would say you present a sort of big history account that goes all the way back to the origins of the universe. And you present sort of a sequence of, let's say, they're a sequence of emergent levels of complexity rooted in new emergent information processing systems that create new levels of complexity that then stack on top of each other. And that stack, beginning with matter, which sort of arises out of energy, you get matter, there's life, there's mind, and culture. And each one of these has a joint point of like where this new information processing system sort of comes online. So for matter, it's, you talk about quantum gravity. I mean, it's sort of basically like a physics sort of presupposition there. But and then from matter, you get the joint point of sort of, the neo-Darwinian synthesis of genetic information is now the information processing. And then from there, you get into mind, which is where the joint point is behavioral investment theory, I guess would be the theory about that. And then from there, you get into culture, which is where symbolic language emerges, and notions then about human psychology and self-consciousness is related to language. So that's sort of the stack that emerges. It emerges, in time, and it emerges in these sort of sequenced stages of complexification through information processing. That's sort of the big picture. And then so that was kind of, did I do a decent?
Beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Great job. And in fact, that's the wonderful description of the core essence of that. The new map of big history I propose is called the Tree of Knowledge System. For a lot of different reasons it's called that. But yes, the energy, starting with sort of actually it starts with sort of an energy information base. Then you get matter, which is the complexification and freezing of energy into chunked domains of information. I wouldn't say really matter processes information, but that's a complicated whatever. But then you get life processing through cells and genes essentially, and then communicating. And then mind is nervous system and animal. And then person, culture is language, symbolic language on top. And each one of those, technically those are dimensions of complexification. The only reason I say that is there are actually levels inside each dimension, and that helps to differentiate some, but that's all just technical BS. The basic gist that you provide is brilliant, and that is central. In fact, I consider that the central key insight that grounds UTOK. It's the first key idea if we get into the whole UTOK garden frame, which is another kind of metaphor that I use to kind of guide the system. But I really appreciate that summary. It's brilliant.
Cool. All right. So using that as sort of our ground, then I'd love to dig into this a bit. So these meta-narrative frameworks, I think, are very they're a point of great interest in metamodern communities, and the kind of turn to meta-narrative thinking again. A very important meta-narrative framework. I would say two that are of particular interest for the communities that we're in, which is basically the Hanzi metamodernist kind of meta-narrative that he's sort of espousing there. And in some ways, that is itself sort of an extension or a development of integral theory frameworks and that sort of meta-narrative. And so, but what I find interesting about where you're coming at all this from is, one, largely independent. It sounds like, and we spoke briefly a little while ago about this, but it sounds like you kind of discovered some of that stuff in the process of writing your book and thinking about this, which I find really cool, because it's not, it's not sort of like a genetic lineage. It's like when there's sort of multiple lines of independent investigation going on here. And when those cohere, I think that's really exciting. And also, I think a really important difference is that you're coming at this from a psychological background within the field of psychology, and you and John Vervaeke and Zach Stein do a great series on metapsychology, where you kind of lay out the need for a metapsychological framework given sort of the chaos of the field of psychology. So in many ways, this work is sort of a response to that, and it's a solution to fitting all these things. I think very, very well done to sort of situate all the different kind of currently fragmented fields of psychology into this framework. So that's another important element of this. But so I wanted to ask you this. So given that there are these other sort of frameworks floating around out there, what are some points of commonality, and what are some points of distinction that you think are important? Maybe specifically with one with like integral theory, which I think a lot of people will be very familiar with.
Totally. Well, first off, I love that great synopsis. And so let me just double click on a few things, and then I'll come back to integral. So one thing is complete independence. Okay, so when I first published in 2003, the first official presentation I make in the professional literature is called the Tree of Knowledge System. That's the mind, matter, life, mind, culture thing, and the theoretical unification of psychology and review of general psychology. I don't cite Wilber. That's a 2003 paper, because embarrassingly enough, I didn't know about Wilber. Okay, so this entire system is completely independently generative, and I don't know about Wilber. Somebody writes me and says, hey, how come you didn't cite Wilber? And I was like, who? Okay, and the reason is because I'm inside the academy deeply. I'm right in the heart of the University of Pennsylvania, University of Vermont. I'm talking with the established academy. People like Steve Pinker are people I'm citing, definitely, and Jonathan Haidt. Well, maybe not back then, but anyway, the point of it is that I'm in the bowels of the standard academic tradition. Okay, so that's one thing. A second thing I'll say in relationship to my syncing up with metamodernism and all of its forms is really one of the most amazing synchronicities I've ever encountered in my life, and I've encountered several. But the idea of a post-postmodern grand meta-narrative that I was framing, and that I could transcend the modern scientist philosophy, Kant, Newton, all of that, into Hegel, maybe, whatever. You get that and Enlightenment, and you get the postmodern critique. The idea that we could find a synthesis between the thesis of science, as it were, and its truth claims, and the antithesis critical claim that everything's contextualized in a system of justification. Well, I figured out, at least from the system I built, is actually those are two partial truths that you can synthesize. There is a way to frame science in some transcendent truth claims, like, hey, the material universe is made up of atoms. That's not just a culturally contingent claim. That's actually a truth claim. And at the same time, it is a socially constructed system of justification that exists inside a particular historical context, and then you have to understand that. And then I had found a path to then essentially resolve that thesis antithesis split, and then say, hey, the next thing will be some synthesis off of this. Okay. Certainly somebody like Roy Bhaskar, who I didn't know about critical realism at the time, had seen a very similar kind of bridging between understanding the social construction of knowledge and the Tina principle, there is no alternative, that nature is stratified and science teaches us ontological truths about the world. And that's essentially a very similar pattern. So my synergy, I didn't know anything about metamodernism until, say, 2018, when I'm on Alexander Bard's intellectual deep web list, and then starting to then following the wake of Jordan Peterson. All of a sudden I get popped into the Rebel Wisdom crowd, and then learn both about Lene Rachel Anderson's Metamodernity, and then Brent Cooper's doing metamodern stuff. And then I learned the Hansi Freineck books, which are back there somewhere and I think the black thing's right down there. And then the explosion of, oh my God, there's an entire structure that essentially is defined as a post-postmodern grand meta-narrative. Seeing Hansi's work in relationship to, oh, here's a developmental, psychological, philosophical, sociological analysis of politics that bridges modernity, postmodernity, and speaks to the way we might socially organize our value systems and utilize all of that, was just breathtaking. I found Lene Rachel Anderson's articulation of the evolution of cultural sensibility from the oral indigenous into the traditional, into the modern, into the postmodern structure, and then set the stage for one that includes and transcends and creates a metamodern cultural sensibility that has the strengths of each and integrates them, to be exactly the kind of sentiment that I was looking for. And another unbelievable metamodern experience of synergy was when I learned the sensibility of metamodernism can be framed in terms of its cultural ethos and things like that, artistic genre, as sincere irony. And this was another thread of unbelievable synergy. I was reading here at this computer, okay, and I was reading on, and I saw sincere irony, and whatever my schematic was at the time, I saw those two words and they fucking hit my soul. And I went like that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Literally, I'm by myself. I literally have to like turn around and look at that. And I'm like, holy fuck. I was called to build this garden, and the entire ethos of the garden and the entire structure of the tree of knowledge, and into the garden, and this crazy cartoon. I mean, who does peer review on a goddamn cartoon of a garden that says it's all knowledge? I mean, nobody does that, right? It's very ironic. And yet at the same time, it's unbelievably serious, dead serious in relationship to its, and it claims very strong, sincere claims. So I couldn't believe that I'm in the process of being called into an artistic thing, which I was really confused about. I mean, I was like, I never really thought myself as an artist until I built that. And the reason was it was a creative, expressive impulse that my soul called to forth. And I don't care what other people thought. I was just going to build this thing. I knew that I wanted to build this thing. And then to see 4 years later that there's a genre that was happening in the cultural zeitgeist at large that had exactly the same dialectic that I was playing off of in terms of motif and genre and message, I was like, oh my God, I'm just part of a zeitgeist here. I'm just getting pulled into a vacuum of a zeitgeist, which the tree of knowledge frames is this fifth joint point digital metaverse that we have to somehow figure out how to navigate our way through. It was unbelievable. And so my synergy with metamodernism and a metamodern spirituality, a sensibility that grounds science in a particular way that extends naturalism in a way that's coherent with our souls and spirits. I mean, and then seeing people like John Vervaeke and then all the movements and just being part of this zeitgeist, it's been amazing. I'm thrilled and fascinated and awestruck and spiritually moved and all of that. So that's the metamodern thing. The Wilber connection's interesting. So I get this notice in 2004. Hey, there's a philosopher, psychologist guy who went on a spiritual journey and thinks he built this integral theory that ties philosophy and psychology and spirituality all together. Okay. So I then dive into Wilber in 2004. At this time, I'm just starting to get loosened. I was raised a new atheist. Okay. I'm get trained in behavioral science methodology. I am a critical analytic thinker. Okay. And actually, one of the things that's really interesting, I'll just say out here, I consider myself the most scientific person around, okay? Which is, and at the same time, I'm deeply spiritual, all right? But I'm deeply scientific in the way I'm organized, okay? And like I put that against Sean Carroll or any, physicist Sean Carroll or anybody, I'm actually unbelievably committed to science. But then I was trained in science in a particular way that I realized unbelievably broken and limited. I also get trained in a modernity view of traditional Christianity that was, I realized, unbelievably broken and limited. But my point of it is that 2004, I'm not too far away from a Dawkins God delusion. And almost now I would call myself scientistic in the way I would judge things, and definitely trapped in the theistic versus atheistic view, as opposed to now being a nun like a John Vervaeke, and we can get into what I'm framed at, but this is 2004. So then I open up Wilber, and I'll admit, I'm fascinated. I am definitely fascinated. The breadth of it, the depth of it, the interest of it. And the thing that captures me ultimately pretty quickly are two of what I would consider the great strengths. And this isn't, and I'm not going to say anything novel here, but there's two unbelievably great strengths to Wilber's view. And that's captured in all qual. But it is the quadrants. The quadrants capture my attention immediately as a brilliant I consider them an epistemological scheme. And what I mean by that these are the ways people know. And these are frames of knowing, and seeing the 2x2 frame of knowing hit me like a fucking ton of bricks. Okay? And I've always deeply appreciated that. I think it's one of the most elegant, it's kind of like the tree of knowledge. It's one of the most elegant articulations, only the tree of knowledge is more metaphysical and ontological, but it's one of the most elegant philosophical schematics ever been built. I mean, it's really brilliant and beautiful. The other thing that I saw is this developmental line, this evolutionary developmental line with a focus on consciousness, human development, and then into spirituality. Now, when I'm in my Dawkins mode, okay, what happened in retrospect, I had a pretty negative reaction to overall. I mean, those were my very strong positives. But then I'm a hardcore scientist, okay? I'm feeling, in retrospect, a bit competitive and a bit ashamed that I didn't know about this guy because I'm on record and I haven't cited him, And then, but he's out of the academy. I'm in the inside of the academy, and right. You're an arrogant person when you're on the inside, and you're basically.
I was sorry to interrupt, but I almost wonder if it would have hurt you to cite Wilber, because I mean, the reason why I mentioned the independent origin of your work as being very rooted in the academy is because I think that that's a significant thing, and we can talk about it. But the role that the academy plays and the way that it views certain kinds of inquiries and frameworks and framings of things is interesting, and certain sources might even sort of be kind of deleterious to credibility in certain contexts. So it could be a happy accident of some kind.
Right. I mean, and certainly it's embarrassing as a scholar that I didn't throw a citation or two of Wilber in there, because it reveals my ignorance of him. I would not have cited him favorably at the time. So I would have said, well, there are some other ones, but obviously, and what I would have immediately nailed him on is his spiritual ontology. Okay, so Wilber basically commits to a spiritual ontology, essentially. So, okay, through his insights and connections to the East, we realized that actually the ultimate ground of being is spirit. And somehow the ground of being, through his introspection, he's able to see beyond the Big Bang, and before the Big Bang, you go up to spirit, and spirit collapses and then turns into the Big Bang, and now we're realizing this. But the ultimate ontology has to be seen as a spiritual ontology. Well, from your, physicist, show me the fucking money here, buddy. What are you talking about? You meditate a little bit and all of a sudden, the beginning of the universe. So that's your naturalist scientific edge. And I saw that as deeply limited, and then would have basically been like, oh, okay. And so my early reaction to Wilber, although I was deeply impressed by the two strong parts of it, what I still consider to be the two strong points. So the other one's is developmental, so all quadrants, and then so he's got the quadrants and the lines. Then what happens is I have a really interesting and powerful connection with a man by the name of Andre Marquis. He's a professor of counseling psychology in counseling, and he's really a psychotherapist. And we merged together in the world of integrated psychotherapy. In fact, I'm the incoming president of the Society for Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. And what Andre had done was he had gone through a developmental path on his own, through some spirituality stuff and Eastern wisdom stuff, and then constructive developmental psychology through Michael Mahoney. And then he finds Wilber and then sees Wilber as offering an unbelievable schematic to tie together a lot of the different epistemologies in psychotherapy, and creates the integral psychotherapy model. So other people were doing it, but I think he did it by far the best. And then he and I become friends. Some people connect us. Somebody, like I have some connections, and got really guy who knows a lot of networks. Like, hey, you got to talk to Andre. And then I'm like, and then we connect, and we're like brothers of another mother. It's immediately like, oh my God. And so then he teaches me integral from a different perspective. He was critical of some of the spiritual ontology, but he then shows me how integral organizes the world of psychotherapy. And I'm deeply impressed. I love Andre, and we've been good friends ever since. This goes back to 2007, and we're going to present something in an upcoming conference. And, so he and I then have been, and then that afforded one level of appreciation for integral for me. And at that level, I was like, okay, Wilber's a serious scholar. Let's not fuck around. This is a serious shit. And so there was that. And then we actually had some integral, unified, and still do synergies about actually unified theory. At that time, as unified theory of psychology, comes unified theory of knowledge. Unified theory does certain things very well, but it's short on other things. And then Wilber's does some things very well. And it's short on others. And we're like, together, we think we can build. And indeed, I think that our conversations together have shown how an integral, unified framework is possible to organize psychotherapy. And that's part of our mission. So then what happens over the last 3 years, okay, a number of things happened to me personally. The short answer is, like many people that is this space, I get sucked into the wake of Jordan Peterson, okay, and literally have a fight with my program about Jordan Peterson. I get pulled into the whole post-Jordan Peterson phenomena as the metamodern sensibility that looks at this and says, hey, you can be on the left, you can be on the right. But the people that are insanely polarized about this are fucking insane. I mean, like, this is a reasonable guy doing interesting things. Watching the polarization culture war around him is like, we're obviously insane. I mean, it's a normal psychologist, actually a very sophisticated psychologist. And the fact that people are going insane about him was insane to me. And that was fascinating. And then, of course, in the context of that, I get into the rebel wisdom world, I get into the metamodern world, and I then see integral in a new light. As a metamodern brotherhood function, I also learn more about crit, which is the critical realist integral theory bridge, whereby Roy Bhaskar's stuff. So the Zach Steins and Benita Roy's and other people that had been involved in making some of those bridges, I learn all about that synergy, which I wasn't aware. I knew a little bit about critical realism, but I didn't know that critical realism and integral had synced up. And the way in which some people like Paul Marshall had been like, oh, well, the ontology perspective from critical realism is great, and the epistemology perspective of Wilber is great. And then I read some of the, critical meta theory review stuff on that. A couple of books came out on that, and I was just blown away watching that try to synthesis. So then returning and Wilber's analysis of the colors and the mean green machine, I thought I actually got chewed up by the mean green machine in my own And so I thought that was really great. So his materialistic flatland view, his critique of society, I know that the whole integral community did its diaspora, and Ken had some fucking problems, let's be clear. But I came to deeply respect that. And the short answer is what I already alluded to, is that what I see him in terms of affording the critique of the academy, the need for what I would now call a coherent integrated pluralism, and we need synthetic post-postmodern grand meta-narratives to coordinate the coherent integrated pluralism sensibility, to move us from the chaotic fragmented pluralism, to move us away from a scientistic materialism that's soul killing, to bridge us to appreciate much richer diversity appreciation that revitalizes the soul and spirit. So that's now my sensibility. And then I've gone off the deep end on the academy anyway. I start becoming a shaman on a hill. I'm outside the academy more and more. And so my affiliation for what Ken was doing just grew tremendously. And the short answer of the blend of affiliation is there's the sixth thing on there. It's called the Wheel of Development. Okay, it's the little black and white one. It's actually a picture of a wheel. And what it has is an axle of adaptation. And then around this is the growth of various domains of human. One is identity, another values and virtues, morality, another one is abilities and talents, another's challenges, another's dispositional traits. Those are 5 different domains. I can take Wilber's lines of development, basically. If you take integral psychology and you look at it, it's lines of development across all the different domains. I can basically take that wheel of development, which I have not, as Zach Stein's like, Henriques, you're underdeveloped on development. I was like, it's totally true, Zach, help me out. I was like, I've done plenty, but help me out, Zach. So, okay, so it's underdeveloped on development. I can take Wilber's lines and basically draw lines off the spoke of that wheel, I'm critical of Wilber because he really understands the problem of psychology, and the equivocation of language is shit in my field, and he's guilty of that. He just jams everything in there, and it's not pristine and clear. It's just one label after another of ambiguous space. But the general overview of it is brilliant, and so you can plug his lines of development inside the wheel of development on the tree of life behind me, 6th branch in particular. Okay. And the other thing is that I can now take, in fact, I've incorporated in one of the B's and in other areas, I can take the quadrants and epistemologically, sync them up very deeply. So I want to bridge over and synergistically connect and grab those quadrants and help an integrated pluralistic epistemological vantage point. And there's an enormous amount of his ontology of the great Bane and Being that's basically TOK. There's minor, the core of it at spirituality versus what I call energy information. And then I'm agnostic about the ultimate ground of reality. But anyway, so you get this developmental line, this critique about materialistic flatland, the need for a coherent integrated pluralism, and then this beautiful epistemological quadrants that I now can sync up with somebody who sees psychotherapy through the integral perspective. I'm seeing it through the unified approach perspective, see all of that harmony, recognize the need to move from a current chaotic fragmented pluralism to a post-postmodern grand meta-narrative that's a coherent integrated pluralism, which means that there are multiple perspectives that are giving frames. And now I can sit in very, very good harmony with the integral vantage point.
Wow. Okay. So let's zoom in on some of that then, because I think that's a great sort of like connection of a whole bunch of different things. So, and maybe in some ways this will seem remedial and a bit rudimentary at first, but I think it's important, and I'd like to see some pretty explicit synergies and harmonies and synthesis go on, because at the very first level, I think it's important to establish that just beyond the fact that different people are tuning back into the idea of thinking in grand narratological terms, there's also a lot of consensus about what that narrative is. And that's what one of the things that I want to kind of put my finger on a little bit here. And it's a narrative of big history that unfolds via sequential kind of emergent leaps of complexity. And that at these, what you locate as these joint points, right, there are new kind of qualitatively different domains or realms that come online that can't be reduced to their substrates the way that sort of modern reductionism would do, And I think that that's a big part of how this narrative kind of winds up saving the soul, as it were, from sort of the clutches of reductionism.
Lovely, Swift. Lovely. Yeah. I'm 100% agreement.
Okay, so there's some really interesting overlap there that I'm seeing, and again, just sort of like trying to block this in like a composition. It's like, okay, if there's a meaningful way that is sort of the basic narrative that we're working in, now we can start to clarify and refine here. And so, Wilber's got physiosphere, biosphere, noosphere, right? So going from the material to the biological to the sort of mental. Now you've got matter, life, mind, culture. So where he's sort of working with three, and of course he didn't coin those. I guess he's taking those from Desjardins, I think. But the way that I kind of sync those up, and I would just curious to see if this is what you would, if you think this is the right way of framing this, is that sort of the physiosphere, I think pretty maps onto what you're talking about as matter.
Totally.
What Wilber says as the biosphere, I think you make a distinction between life and mind, because as I read you, what you're talking about with mind is not like a human mind, my self-conception of everything. You're talking about sentience. Totally. You're talking about animal level perception, motivation, things like that, which I think most people would relate to the biosphere. That's we haven't reached the level of the noosphere. So in the biosphere, we could kind of link up with life and mind, and then what you'd call culture, which is where the joint point is with language, which I think this is a really fascinating field to explore too, and I think sheds some really cool light on this whole thing, is by framing the joint point there as language, and that language is the sort of introductory element that starts generating the possibility of self-consciousness, and also then symbol construction, et cetera, that's where culture comes from. I think, well, one, just to finish that little taxonomy there, I think that maps pretty well with the noosphere that Wilber speaks about.
Totally.
But it also clarifies it in an interesting way, because now we're really getting to what's at the core of it, which is the linguistic emergence, which is also, I think, pretty unquestionably a sort of more or less universally recognized a unique feature of humanity, which isn't to say that other animals don't communicate, but the idea of sort of symbolic language and everything, and tying that to self-consciousness is then a very interesting thing to do. So anyway, but just maybe start there, like that, you find that a decent sort of mapping.
It's exactly the right mapping. Okay. And so most, in fact, I have a book right here called many people do essentially what you do is 3 big bangs.
Oh, interesting. Who's that by?
This by Holmes Ralston III. Okay. Cool. And big history sort of is the same way if you know how to pay attention to the threshold. So so you get, okay, Big Bang actually happens. You go to some sort of energy or nothing to matter or whatever. Quantum fluctuation gives rise to the physical universe. Okay. Physiosphere. And then almost everybody then jumps over and says, okay, life. Big history has the actual big history world has 8 thresholds total. They have 4 thresholds in that first jump, and then the next one's into life, and then they have a few subcategories of that. And then they go up to persons, okay? And so the idea of the physiosphere, the biosphere, and then the noosphere, those 3 is very, very common for the big history flavors. Like, in other words, when you do big history, sort of, what are these complexification issues? And then getting the specifics about this complexification is where all the marbles are. Well, from within a UTOK kind of perspective of what unique it offers. But from your point of view, or let's go jump out and be like, hey, postmodern grand meta-narrative, from a science side perspective, I would definitely argue we want to make it simple. The natural science side perspective is pretty fucking clear. And that is, if you take any kind of realism, you have a time by complexification, evolution that captures the universe in Big Bang, then matter happens, and then life happens, and then, certainly animals, primates, and then humans happen as culture and whatever, and now you're up there. And those 3 things are almost ubiquitously identified. And some do another move in between the living and the human person as the animal or the mental. Some do that. And of course, UTOK does that, and UTOK does that very, very specifically. And it has a very strong logic. And it says, if you miss the joint point, okay, going from living organisms to what I would call, in working with John Vervaeke, minded animals, okay? A minded animal as a sensory motor loop, okay? It's got a brain, a complex active body. I mean, we can trail the evolution. You get jellyfish, and then you get planaria worms, and they're doing certain kinds of things. They don't really have, they got brains, unlike jellyfish, but they don't have complex active bodies. And then the Cambrian explosion, those planarian worm-like things go into complex active bodies, essentially like crabs, okay? And then meaning that now you have a sensory motor mechanism that lives up, moves up outside the plant movement layer, and then starts interacting, reproducing prey predation. You get what I would call a mental behavioral ecology, okay? And the term mental in that term is a description, just like living. It's a description of the kind of behavior of a sensory motor loop animal that's sensing and moving and reacting. So then mind actually in the system is behaviorally defined. And this is a weird thing, but it's like you can watch from a third person perspective the sensory motor looping and functional awareness and responsivity of animals. You do it all the time. You go around, you go for a walk, and you watch the birds and the bees behave very differently than the flowers and the trees. In fact, if the flowers and the trees got up and started biting at you, you'd be flipped out. You know, you're like, okay, you intuit that birds and bees behave very differently. And they do. They behave at a fundamentally different, complex, adaptive level. And what the tree of knowledge says is that there's a joint point that we can specify. There's a channeling system that gives rise to this domain of mental behavioral ecology, okay? And it's one of the great philosophical problems that's overlooked. And it's at the heart of the problem of psychology, whether psychology is behavioral or mental.
Yeah.
And then the tree of knowledge says, oh, it's actually mental behavior. We fucked this up. It's the kind of behavior we're scientifically interested in. And by the way, mental behavior is the context in which sentience, the first person experience of being, probably starting with pleasure and pain, emerges. Okay. So it actually captures sentience, which, by the way, from a scientific perspective is a very fucking difficult thing, especially even in the animal world. We can talk about that. But as a scientific object of entity, you know, that you observe from the third person exterior, sentience is really tricky. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, that mental behaviorism, and then this Cambrian explosion in the TOK land, 525 million years ago, you see the evolution of things like insects and crabs, more or less, all the way up to primates. And then with the primate land, you get into great apes, and then you get in the hominid great ape, and the hominid great ape takes off, creates a really networked social system where we actually jam together before language in an intersubjective space where we read each other's attention and intention. Then we symbolically tag shit. And then all of a sudden we symbolically syntactically tag shit, and that gives rise to language. And by the way, then the key insight in 1996, the start of this whole fucking thing, it's not exactly language per se, but it's actually propositions and question answers that create rise to the problem of justification. It's like the structure and function of language are propositional networks of justification that are thought about or challenged through question and answer dialogue. And it is that structure functional understanding that language is organized as a justification system, such that the culture person plane of existence isn't just language randomly, but it's the bricked network together of language in question answer dialogue that's crisply defined as a concept or dynamic of justification across scale. And then you get that, and you're like, holy shit, that like nails things.
So I want to again zoom in on a couple of these elements first there. One is, this is why I mentioned the importance of the way that this was framed as an answer to sort of the chaotic fragmentation of psychology as a field, because I think it brilliantly does sort of resolve that confusion, right? If you've got like a sort of behavioralists over here, like people studying rats and some people being psychotherapists asking about dreams, and it's like, well, what is psychology, right? But then it's like, if you can appreciate that a human being is both an animal operating at the behavioral level of, you know, behavioral investment, and also primates, a linguistic and a justification creature, we've got multiple levels, and that psychology is pertaining to, in some ways, both of those elements, but it needs to be parsed correctly in order to understand all that. So yeah,
somebody got the
book. So yes, I think that that's really cool and really insightful and really helpful. And it could be, you know, again, and it sounds like maybe it is becoming increasingly sort of revolutionary in the field of psychology, and as people are you know, taking this online. But so I wanted to ask you two things. One, I definitely want to come back to the justification hypothesis and all that, because I'm really interested in worldviews and how these adapt and evolve and that sort of a thing. Both at the at the cultural level, but then as we sort of download them culturally, and then they become part of our own, individual domain. But before we go to that route, I wanted to ask you about, again, you're framing this as sort of sequential. I don't want to overemphasize the sequential nature necessarily, but you're framing this as different sorts of information processing frameworks. And that as those come online, you get these qualitatively new kind of emergent domains. I'm curious what you think, though, about something like, let's say, integrated information theory, right? Which is what, I'm not sure if how familiar you are with it, but like the idea of
I know about that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
100%.
Yeah, I'm curious about if really all the way this goes down is information and information processing. What I find really compelling about about IIT is a kind of beautiful potential synthesis between what we think of as sort of panpsychism and sort of a hard scientific understanding of consciousness. So I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you might sort of bring in that IIT framework into this sort of model.
Totally. Think about the vertical stack as an IIT dimension. Okay, so the vertical stack of complexification can be really thought of as, by complexification, we mean the intersection between various parts that then they get differentiated, coordinated, and integrated. That's essentially what it means. Now, IIT requires for it to have something that then stores, learns, and adjusts. Okay. And then that becomes actually the proper thing of that is consciousness in relationship to its constituents and its capacity to engage in functional awareness and responsivity. Okay. And in that regard, absolutely, you can then say, well, cells, exhibit consciousness defined in that regard. Okay. And certain kinds of even inanimate organized systems, like they go down to a photodiode, and the photodiode that they train in a particular way that discriminates and then adjusts is the first sort of integrated consciousness information entity that the lowest level. And this is just the little machine you actually build now is conscious. Okay. Which is like, be careful, guys. Okay. The metaphysics of this is all shitty here, at the level of that. But if you think about the stack of vertical stack on the TOK as complexification, okay, then exactly that's very close to integrated information, especially once you get to life, because it's an integrated information that coordinates, remembers, and shifts to make predictions and adaptive behavior. And so at that level, you get integrated information as functional awareness and responsivity at the biological level. Now, what gets confusing, okay, is that as I write in my current book fundamentally is about really getting to the metaphysics and ontology of all of this very clear. When I use the word metaphysics, I mean, what actually is what's your descriptive vocabulary? And then the ontology, what's your referent in the world that you're talking about, okay? And I think IIT is misleading because you can have a very integrated information system that's exhibiting functional awareness and responsivity, but it's dark inside. It's a zombie. It doesn't have any experience, sentience, felt experience of being. And my basic sense would be that's probably the case of cells and trees even. Okay, whether they actually, you can demonstrate functional awareness and responsivity. In fact, we do it all the time without felt subjective experience of being, what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. This is a totally different thing.
Well, but question though, because that they almost definitionally set up the idea that no, as long as these structural integrated information processing loops are created, that is sentience, that is basic awareness.
That's what they try to set up. I don't find that. I think that's a metaphysical move that's deeply sleight of handish and deeply confusing, because I don't think that there's good evidence to suggest that we can now equate that integrated process with sentience itself. You can actually argue there'd be many good reasons to believe you would be able to see that and have complete absence of sentience, not sentience on a dimension. Sentience has not happened yet. And I think certainly for me, sentience happens in the context of a neurobiological field. You don't have a neurobiological field, that there's something that happens with the magic of a neurobiological field that affords sentience.
So this would be a meaningful distinction then to make between between the UTOK framework and both IIT as well as Wilbur, which is that you basically wouldn't suggest, or I guess I could try to frame this as a question. To what degree is it meaningful to suggest that something like consciousness goes all the way down? right?
Exactly.
Do you buy into the sort of that Whiteheadian prehension idea or anything like that? Is there
So,
any? Yeah.
Yep. So there's a metaphysics kind of that makes it interesting. I believe that the only way our categories of mind are going to understand the universe are through what I certainly scientifically, we actually bring the metaphysics of behavior to understand the universe. And that immediately divides you up into entities or objects and fields, and then puts them in nodes of relation so that an object is here and it has then a particular type of perspectival experience where it's going to apprehend the world in a particular way. It's going to have certain kinds of information and force that's available to it that's relative to its position. So you get a metaphysical positionality of a subject that's engaged in some sort of prehension. And our mapping is like, oh, well, that thing's there and it has access to this information. And what is it like inside of that from the first person perspective of an atom? Okay. So you get the metaphysical mapping that gives a subjective objective flavor. But I'm very suspicious to take any meaningful, that's a mapping from metaphysical, positions, and then turn it into, well, then ergo inside of that thing is some unbelievably small inkling of prehension that relates to the qualia that I experience if I hit my hand and feel some pain. That's a jump I'm not really willing to make. So I see the metaphysical stuff there but I think that's basically all darkness at the level of sentience. And then I see the first level of consciousness, which I define in terms of functional awareness and responsivity at the life level. Cells make decisions. You can argue, they definitely demonstrate an analysis of what's going on at some level. They make decisions. I see them as complex adaptive systems with semantic subjective processing. Okay. But I also see them basically as robots. Like a cell isn't any more conscious than Deep Blue, the chess playing machine, in my estimation. Okay. But it exhibits the functional awareness and responsivity that gets collaborated into the neuro information processing system, which is also a coordinated functional awareness and responsivity. So you see in a planaria worm or a jellyfish, some coordinated neurosystem that's doing that. That's what I actually call mind one, especially when you see it like in an insect. So mind one refers to the neurocognitive, this is my current book, not in that book, but the neurocognitive functional view of animal behavior like an insect, like a housefly. Okay, it's got a brain, it's got sensory motor, it's detecting your swatting. Okay, it's trying to fly away. All right. Do we know that there's something that it's like to be a housefly? Okay, at any level of experience. Okay, the answer is no, we don't have really good arguments right now. You have compelling arguments on both sides of the equation. I am a believer that sentience essentially happens early in ancient form. And essentially what I believe happens is a way to yoke together sensory input with desired states, like, complex dynamic adaptive desired states called that. This becomes for the PME equation. And then you have energized motion, and then pleasure and pain hook up with sensory inputs to deliver charges to approach and avoid. And that creates at least a functional binding dynamic whereby you get this focal point that's coordinating input, desire, and output in relationship to particular salient control variables. And it's at that level. And in fact, I have several books right here that make the early case that consciousness is these sensory affective jolts that are connecting and binding together the animal behavior, approach, avoid, and pleasure pain then becomes the base of sentience as it's coordinating the behavior of the animal as a whole. That's an argument. You can make a lot of good anecdotal, constructed, but in terms of mechanisms, do we know what gives rise to this and when? And do you know whether a housefly is just a robot or not? That's actually a very, very, I would consider that an undetermined right now. You have different debates on either side, and it's a cool question.
Okay, well, that's helpful to know. And it's interesting to then consider that basically, I mean, part of me wonders then, like the epistemological map that the quadrants affords, kind of, does that upper left quadrant sort of only really come online with then sentient
Totally.
like minimal? Okay, so they're not like so, because you frame them as epistemological, and I think that almost in a more of an integral sense, I get them as being more ontological, right? That these
right.
And of course
certainly
Well, no,
I mean, he draws like a great chain of being, although I take the tree of knowledge and do that, right? I see them as human epistemological quadrants. That's what I see them as. And then he maps them as the quadrants are both onto epistemological structures. And he layers the lines across the classic quadrant picture's got lines. Those are ontological lines that he's seeing. So this is not just, it's an onto-epistemology for Wilber. I'm critical of that. I don't think that the interior of an atom, which he sticks there and he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about, okay? Our knowledge of the interior of an atom's prehension and what we would even say a helium atom, feels, even at any level of sense making, I find that to be a very debatable stretch, and ontologically it doesn't make sense to me. So yeah.
So now what about the idea that as we recognize these increased levels of complexification emerging in the universe, trying to make sense of that reality by means of some kind of motivational force that is sort of inherent in pretty much, well, even at the level of crude matter. I mean, you touch on this a little bit towards the end of the book, of sort of talking about the God question and whether or not, and I think you do a good job at that. But I think that would be sort of a way that kind of my sense of sort of a Whiteheadian or even a Wilberian answer of this would come in and be like, well, no, there's really something that's still motivated there in some way. What do you make of that?
I'm agnostic about that. So I consider myself an agnostic, atheistic syntheist, okay, in terms of my overall theology. What that means is I'm not a foundationalist about truth claims. I consider the unified theory a unified theory of knowledge for the 21st century. What I mean by that, 300 years from now, that's fucking full of shit. Okay. It's like, we're going to change everything and I'm going to get a lot of shit wrong. And I certainly don't have God's eye view of truth by any stretch. I don't think anybody does. I'd be curious of that. So it's a contextualized system. It's certainly like Bhaskar. I make ontological claims that I feel are justified, that transcend cultural claims. We get cumulative knowledge, but I'm not a foundationalist. So that's key. And then the thing that I want to kind of help people, think about is that we can change the ontology of matter versus mind, the way it came out of the Enlightenment. I actually talk about what's called the Enlightenment gap, is all fucked up. It's the wrong ontology. And we can shift our ontologies through this picture that actually revitalizes our soul and spirit. Okay. And then rebridges and reclaims many, many different things. So when we get to then this issue of God, okay, syntheism. So I'm atheistic with regards to personal belief in personal gods that care about this conversation and that we would know that. People can certainly have faith in that. They feel that. I respect all of that. But that is a theological, theistic position. I'm without belief in that and whatever. But I am then a syntheist. Alexander Bard turned me into a syntheist, which means I believe in the concept of God, okay, and the God we create. All right. And the synergies by which we are called to create something transpersonal to us. Okay. That we can sense what good, true, and beautiful is and be called into that in a particular way is unbelievably meaningful to me. And I've had some spiritual revelations. Okay. Some spiritual revelations. All right. That feel that there's maybe an ontology on the cusp of that thing. Okay.
Cool. I'd like to hear about those.
So, there's an empirical one.
You don't have to get into it right now.
No, I'll give you a straightforward. I'm an empiricist. There's an empirical one. There's a thing called the fucking singularity, okay, which people like Ray Kurzweil talk about. You hear that all the time. All right. Well, there's a guy, a Russian scholar in a big history journal, which actually I published my work in Big History Journal, and then I was reviewing big history journals, and I came across this guy's work, Korolev. He's a Russian, sorry if I get his name wrong. Anyway, this guy looked at the analysis of evolution of complexification, okay? And he took Kurzweil's stuff, but he's a Russian, so he knows all the Russian history, and they have a whole different indicators of evolutionary key moments. So now you have two data sets, an Eastern and a Western data set about the time to the next big event. It's very simple metrics. Okay, so this took 5 million years, and this took 500,000 years, and this took 50,000 years, and this took 5,000 years, and this took 500 years, and this took 50 years, which, by the way, is basically our evolution. Really interesting logarithmically. So this guy puts the Ray Kurzweil plot from the Western side of the equation. And then he argues that actually Kurzweil missed that it's a hyperbolic exponential. If you really want to map it, it's a simple term, but you need to add another exponential that Ray Kurzweil missed at the tail end of the acceleration. Okay. So he takes his hyperbolic exponential, looks at the Eastern and looks at the Western lines. Okay. Puts this super simple equation on it. All right. has a 0.996 correlation, unheard of in the context of any social stuff, 0.994 correlation here, and they cross, okay, one crosses 2027, meaning that the lines are happening so much that they basically go to vertical, which means the time between the next biggest n is 0 within this context, okay? And this one goes to 2029, okay? So the vertical line in the context of evolution of complexity is lined up to happen sometime between a window of 2027 and 2029. And here, in a flash of insight that I have in 1997, okay, I draw out four cones, right? Matter, life, mind, and culture. I'm stoned in Vermont, Burlington, and have a freaking flash, all right? And then as I'm, digesting what the hell this means, each one of these is an information processing communication system. I now emphasize communication system is really key also. I didn't in the book. It's information processing within, communication nodes between. That's the really complex adaptive network. You see that with life, you see it with mind, you see it with culture. And I'm then, once I get the code, that what the fuck are these goddamn cones, right? I'm like, oh, that's what they are. They're complex adaptive systems, mediated information processing, engaged in communication. And that's not reducible to the physical stuff beneath it because it's the informational form that actually generates the content, the response, and that's not reducible to the microscopic physical states. Ergo, you cannot get ontological reduction. Anyway, but once you make that, you're like, okay, well, obviously I'm not that stupid. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So then you ask, well, what is it? What happened to each? Well, there was an information processing network that started to get distributed, and then all of a sudden it started to come together at a higher organizational level. Well, I mean, you look back at the goddamn 20th century and you ask a question: was there an emergence of a novel information processing system? Did it begin to get networked together, and was there increasing interface about it? And is it not quite at a place where it gets synthesized and then organized at a global level? It's like, oh my God, we laid down the landscape for a novel information. The digital metaverse gets laid down in the 20th century, and now we're in the 20th century, and that's we're going to have a Cambrian explosion. We're going to have the fifth joint point. This is all 1997, 1998, where I see the fifth joint point. The idea that you can then go find this Russian guy, track the evolution of complexity, and says, actually, this point is going to happen between 2027 and 2029. And I'm looking at my life going, what the fuck? How the hell is that empirical reality real in some random, variation and selection retention of a universe that isn't alive? I don't know. But I tell you what, it gets all my cells going. All right, I'm agnostic. I'm tapping out on any genuine ontological claims. But I feel spiritually oriented to this thing in a particular kind of way.
Yeah. And
my science side is like, all right, buddy, if you're looking at those kinds of data, I'm with you.
So this is so cool, and I'm really okay. So yeah. And I think that one of the things that, I don't know, Bard in the Syntheism book, they talk about, kind of not relegating God to the beginning of the universe, but totally. not sort of seeding him the idea of God, but sort of taking that up and projecting that into the future. There's a great poetic quote about that. I'll have to throw in the bottom somewhere. But anyway, so then this gets into like all this omega point and Teilhard de Chardin and all that sort of stuff, totally. Which I'm super interested in. But here's one of my concerns where a lot of this comes up for me, and I think probably a lot of people will resonate with this, is that I've been very cynical and skeptical about sort of the transhumanist, kind of like singularity. Totally. It sort of breeds, it plays into the sort of, Silicon Valley will save us, tech gods, Elon Musk sort of mythos.
Fucking disaster.
Yeah. And so I want to be able to embrace the idea that these new technologies that are coming online and maybe even will produce some kind of total qualitative shift in the next decade of all, civilization, essentially. I'm open to the idea that that's going to be deeply meaningful as well, but it's a challenge, right? And God, this is sort of the challenge, I guess.
Right. So I call this, here for me, so your fifth joint point, I call this the digital identity problem. Okay, digital identity problem. So the digital identity problem is this idea that we're at this very precarious place. We're on the edge of the horizon of heaven and hell. Okay, and there are all sorts of things. We've developed this modernity, post-modernity, gives us unbelievable amounts of power in certain domains, in the physical world, okay, and we can manipulate shit, okay, but because we don't get the ontology right, it saps our souls. We get a meaning and mental health crisis. And because we're not wisely using our power, we're turning the Anthropocene is pressing on Mother Earth in a brutal way, okay? And we are then also creating all these massive technologies. And now, meaning things like, nuclear weapons and bioweapons for dangerous destruction of an unbelievable scale. And now we're creating the digital metaverse, a la Zuckerberg, okay, which affords all sorts of possibilities. But oh my God, if we're basically having a bunch of quasi-autistic men systematizing this and creating fucking algorithms in relationship to this, we're already alienated as shit from our primate selves. Where the hell are we going to go? Download ourselves in some digital metaverse? Yeah, that's what they want. It's unbelievably terrifying. I was listening to Jordan Hall. I didn't get through it, but his Web 3.0 just came up on, Rebel Wisdom. And he's brilliantly articulating that, what we're going to do. I mean, he says Web 2.0 and cryptocurrency. Well, we'll just engage in game theory. And he's into this. I'm not, he gets it as a critic. But he's basically going, well, we don't really need to think about humans. We just need to think about them as game theoretic actors that are engaging based on investment principles in relationship to structures. And the aggregate of that will be all right. So we'll plug all this shit into algorithmic stuff and we find at this level, of structure. And it's like, yeah, that's gone really well. Just ask Tristan Harris, it's like, oh my God. And they're like, so they're empty vessels. And the unified theory comes along and says, you operate in the digital metaverse that we're fucking empty vessels. You are going to gut this thing and you're going to create all sorts of unbelievable instabilities. What you need is a wisdom stack. You need a coherent, integrated wisdom stack across the dimensions of complexity to afford this to be actually grow in, which means we got to get in touch with the material world. Yes. We also need to understand the living world, that we're living organisms. We need to understand we're goddamn animals into primates. And we're human persons that need all of this stuff. And then we have a digital metaverse on top of that. And we need to understand how to take the empty vessel of a human being and turn that into something that's filled. And I have this thing called the I-Quad coin that I built, okay? The I-Quad coin represents each of us, this side of it, represents each of our human identity, okay? It's a human identity function. And the argument basically is if I listen to what, Jordan Hall's like, yeah, these algorithmic guys, they just, okay, we'll just distribute the probability of algorithmic outcome as empty vessels. It's like, we need to fill each one of those empty vessels with the actual souls that we are. Okay. Right, so the this affords us a digital identity solution that fills in the wisdom stack of human nature in relationship to the emergent digital metaverse. And it's going to be that bridging, if we do it well, that will afford us the orientation toward heaven and allow us to fill in the stack of us as human persons, primates, organisms in a material world that affords us the digital powers, but actually keeps us wisely grounded in what it is that we're actually doing holistically.
Yeah. Well, yes, indeed. No, I think that really helps solidify what the meta narrative's significance is, because right now, I'm new to all this stuff. I just learned about what a holarchy is, earlier this year, but and I've been, I had my whole existential crisis around reductionism and, if we're all just, this, then nothing really matters and all that stuff. I think
a bunch of chemicals.
Yeah. There's such a need to be able to understand the sequential emergent evolutionary sequence and then to provide the context to appreciate the wisdom stack that you need to get in touch with, not just some propositional mental understanding of certain ideas, but to get into all the various substrates that kind of go all the way down. And that's the only way that we can build something at the level of a metaverse that's going to have any legs to it without just the whole thing crumbling down. And so, and then it becomes
hey, brother, that's the mission. That's so exactly the mission.
It's a pedagogical problem, but I also, profoundly, it's a spiritual problem. And here's where I'm really interested. It's a cultural spiritual problem, which means it's a mythological problem. We need to reorient our mythological frameworks to this. And actually, this is a great little segue into one of the last things I want to touch on is, you mentioned this. Let me see if I can find the quote, but you basically say, that we need to, you used the language of, of a new mythology, actually, which, I mean, here you go. You say,
Yep.
I made this connection because I wanted to emphasize the tremendous need for a new mythology for modern times. And this is a big reason why, as I gather, you're generating these symbols and images, the garden and the UTOK tree and all that. And so this is my project that I'm passionate about, that I want to bring people together on. Talking with Vervaeke and Layman Pascal about this, but I want this to be a cultural, broader conversation and a cultural project. It's also, I mean, gosh, if there's a meaning crisis, what more meaningful endeavor could a person pick up than the idea of actively participating in a renaissance of mythological frameworks that are going to save the world by emphasizing the constituted wisdom stack that connects us to our ultimate, both where we're going and where we came from. Like, what, can't get better than that. So,
okay, hey, brother. I mean, and it's really weird as a Dawkins-esque atheist kind of person to evolve the way I did in relationship to this embracing of this entire, the fundamental need for mythos as the cultural sensibility that guides and bridges is an ought and bridges our collective intelligence and gives us purpose and meaning and value. And rather than, oh, myth, it's gods like Santa Claus. I mean, that's not what mythos fundamentally is about. It's about what are we doing collectively in we space that gives us the is ought bridge to orient ourselves. And we put it like that and you're like, oh my God, well, what would be more important, right? Yeah. And then the problem fundamentally is, how do we bridge modernity, traditional Christian, or in this culture, Judeo-Christian for me, because I'm in the Western context, into modern science, into the postmodern critique that then gives rise to a metamodern synthesis. And I didn't know I was doing this, but my whole spirit has been called into this space. And so I named the damn thing the tree of knowledge, okay? And the tree of knowledge, of course, is a reference. The original system is a reference to the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Bible, whereby, you're going to eat off of this thing. And the whole message is, well, are we actually going to wake up and ask questions about what good and evil are? AKA, we're going to actually become self-conscious and justify. In the beginning, there was the word, okay? John Peterson talks about this. And then we ask, well, what the fuck? We're good and evil. And oh my God, I'm naked. And what am I? And oh my God, I'm going to die. And then we fall out of paradise, right? Because we couldn't help ourselves. We had to ask a fucking question. And what good and evil is? You had to eat off the damn tree, right? And then we kept asking more and more questions. And then we fell further and further away. And although we got closer to truth with science, it also killed our souls, is the argument. But now we can get to a place where we actually know how to eat off the tree of knowledge. Okay, that's the whole idea of the tree of knowledge, is actually we can reconstitute science as an origin story. And this is actually Dave Christian from Big History calls his system origin story. Okay, and we can reconstitute it. We can learn through science. Now we've matured toward a second enlightenment, is what I'm actually calling for. So we can actually reestablish good and evil in relationship to scientific truth. Okay, if we have a holistic, coherent, naturalistic ontology that affords us clarity about our subjective agency in relationship to that space. And so I did that, built that thing, and then I got transformed into calling this return then to paradise. I was in a conference where the whole garden popped. It was called Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self. Okay, and there were all these brilliant people there, lots of different processions, but they all got together at the end and they were asked, so now how do we do this? And they basically, in my estimation, they fumbled the question. Nobody was too abstract. I don't know what the self is. And I left there and I was like, hey, and I had these kind of, ATUA was the name of the thing at the time, Unified Theory, Unified Approach. And I was like, hey, I was next to somebody, I was like, who knew my stuff. And I was like, we should plant ATUA seeds and grow ATUA trees. Okay, that's how it actually started. So we cultivate the globally sustainable self. We can return, plant seeds of education, go to Zach Stein, have teacherly authority that is designed to cultivate, not coerce through propaganda, but cultivate a knowledge system and hand off the baton to the next generation with legitimacy and depth and authority and care, and then afford the growth of that. And then what happens is then the growth of that becomes the garden. And so now we can return, and that's now the UTOK tree of life, the first branch of which is the tree of knowledge. So it's a call then we can overcome and we get back to right relationship to the concept of God and return to the garden. And I have a thing called the elephant sun god, which shines above the garden, which is a sign of the ultimate goodness. And then ultimately I've developed as well. We also have this digital identity problem, and I've created the coin, which then each of us affords their capacity for the human identity function to wake up, consciously evolve, put yourself in right relationship to is and ought, and then orient consciously to some coherent integrated pluralism gives us a wisdom stack. That to me is a religion for the nuns.
Amen, brother. Well, I want to be cognizant of time. It's 1:15, so we should probably wrap this up. But yes, I think there's so much synergistic overlap here. I'm really excited.
It seems you got me passionately activated, brother. So there it is. I love that.
There's also so many things we didn't even get to touch on. I wanted to talk more about justification theories or justification hypothesis, the issues of value. And I want to learn more about the iQuad coin for one thing. I want to talk more too about, well, I'd love to hear more about that elephant sun god. That sounds pretty cool. But there's a lot more that I'd love to dive into. Maybe we could return to this at some point. I just, I'll throw out there too, in order to try to propagate and get this stuff out there, and especially the sort of more kind of develop this mythos in a meaningful way and form the kind of pedagogical and symbolic toolkit in order to express and promulgate that understanding of the necessary wisdom stack that's needed. I've got this wiki out there that I don't know if you've seen anything about that. It's got some of your framework in there, but I have
seen that
collaborative, co-creative thing. So I'd love to start making these connections and getting some of this stuff out there, because you've got some of this material already, and it'd be really cool to start mixing this in with a broader conversation, allow this to kind of evolve and adapt and be reapplied and all this sort of stuff. So that's sort of my dream. The kind
makes my heart sing, man. Makes my heart sing. This is exactly what we need to create the seeds for coherent integrated pluralism. We need to thread our systems together exactly, and those kinds of platforms afford that. I'm happy to work. I love this, love what we're doing, love that I've been able to connect with so many people, and there's got to keep growing this. There's a lot of work to be done if we're going to orient towards heaven instead of hell. Let's do it, and I'd love doing it with you.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time. We'll revisit these things, I hope, another time. But in the meantime, Godspeed, my friend. Take care. Thanks again.
All right. I'm happy to come back whenever, man. It's like great joy. You take care.
Awesome. Adios.